Welcome back to our continuing study of the life of the Apostle Paul, Day 21, Paul's third missionary journey. Our passage today is found in Acts chapter 18, verses 18 through 23. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and he took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchreae he cut his hair, for he was under a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, "I will return to you if God wills." And he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next to the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Do you think you have what it takes to sail around the world? Solo. I'm not necessarily speaking of the nautical abilities to handle a sailboat. I'm talking about the ability to go it alone. I mean absolutely alone, for up to a year. No one to talk to, no one to help. The first man to accomplish this feat was Captain Joshua Slocum from Nova Scotia over 100 years ago. It took him 3 years. He wrote of his adventures in Sailing Around the World Alone, where he writes, "To face the elements is, to be sure, no light matter when the sea is in its grandest mood. You must know the sea, and know that you know it, and not forget that it was made to be sailed over." Studies have been conducted in an attempt to understand what goes on in the minds of those who go it alone on such things as long solo trips sailing around the world, or those who hike, ski, dog sled over great distances. It is what is referred to as ICE, intense, confined, and extreme environments. Although most of the information is anecdotal as it pertains to such experiences, the general observations are the person must have a strong internal ability to face the unknown challenges. As Slocum said, you must know that you know it. For the Apostle Paul, his first 3 journeys were with companions. Barnabas went twice, and Silas on his last journey. But on his journey, beginning in Acts chapter 18, Paul sets out alone. In his previous journeys, it is recorded thus in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. "Now in these days prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, every one according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul." The first official missionary journey began this way in Acts chapter 13, verses 2 through 4. "While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, 'Set apart from me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them.' Then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. So being sent out by the Holy Spirit, they went down to Seleucia, and from there they sailed to Cyprus." Next we see in Acts chapter 15, verses 39 through 41, "And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." Here in Acts 18, all we are told is, in verses 22 and 23, "When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples." It is evident that Paul's methods are changing to meet the demands of the growing church. During Paul's previous journey while at Corinth, he writes 2 letters to the young church at Thessalonica. Paul spends well over 2 years at Ephesus in chapter 19. Most scholars agree that Paul writes what we have as 1 Corinthians while here, and likely wrote to the churches at Galatia. While he begins his journey alone, as best we can tell, he does meet up with disciples that he names while at Ephesus. In Acts chapter 19, verse 9, "But when some became stubborn and continued in unbelief, speaking evil of the way before the congregation, he withdrew from them and took the disciples with him, reasoning daily in the hall of Tyrannus." Using these disciples, Paul sends some of them to take care of the issues at Corinth while he is at Ephesus. We read in Acts chapter 19 and verse 21 and 22. "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must see Rome also.' And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." As we move forward into chapter 20, Paul has already expressed his desire to travel further, expanding into Italy. Internal evidence of Paul's letters lets us deduce that Paul then writes another letter to the church at Corinth and also a letter to the church at Rome. He expresses again a desire to go even further now, as far as Spain, which he writes to the Romans. Romans 15, verse 24. "I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you." Dropping down to verse 28, we read, "When therefore I have completed this and been delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you." Paul is taking on more and more responsibilities, as he expresses to the church in Corinth when he tells of the things he has endured thus far, most of which Luke does not record. Listen to what he endures in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 24. "5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. At night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches." While we find Paul delegating responsibilities out to the likes of Timothy and Erastus, Tertius and Apollos, Silvanus, among others, sending them out to teach and admonish the disciples, Paul himself continues to write to the congregations. We have several of these letters as they make up the bulk of the New Testament. But we also have records of other letters that have not been preserved. Paul speaks in 1 Corinthians of a letter he had sent previously, which we don't have. Later, while Paul is in prison, he speaks of a letter to the Laodiceans, which also has not been preserved for us in Colossians 4:16. Paul has big plans, and he seems rushed to fit them all in, as we perceive, as he's headed back to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 20, verse 16, we read, "For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus, so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost." Paul has aspirations to take the gospel far and wide, all the while nurturing those young congregations and disciples. Something awaits Paul in Jerusalem that will not only help him achieve what he desires in traveling to Rome, but also to define his role in what God has promised him would be his fate at the hands of men. What roles and tasks have you taken on in building up the church? And Lord willing, let's meet here again tomorrow and go through another lesson in the life of the Apostle Paul.